these talks are shrouded in secrecy at the moment. There's an agreement I think has been reached that it all needs to be kept, very, very tight hold. So it's difficult to know.
Yeah.
But I suppose it's significant that they are continuing the discussions today, that talks haven't broken off. And I would expect they're not going to be able to accomplish very much. The sides will commit to a continuation of the process. They go back to the capitals to consult further, and then have another go to see if they can actually narrow the differences.
Now, Russia has continued attacking Ukraine overnight ahead of a second day of peace talks between the two sides and US officials in Abu Dhabi. One person was killed and at least 15 were wounded in strikes on Kyiv and Kharkiv, according to Ukrainian officials. John Lough was the first NATO representative in Moscow and now leads the new Eurasian Strategies think tank. John, good morning.
Good morning.
I'm trying to understand what these talks are really based around, and I'm just wondering if actually this is going to emerge as something based on business deals rather than a sort of security strategy as such.
Well, in short, they're based around what was initially a 28-point peace plan worked out by the Russians together with the Americans, largely written by the Russians. That was then adapted by Ukraine and its European allies in consultation with the US, was then taken back to Moscow. And the Russians said there were a lot of elements of this they didn't like. But I think this is the framework that they're using at the moment. And we understand from the US side, Steve Witkoff, when he was in Davos, said there was one outstanding issue and they were making progress. And the issue that he was referring to is the problem of territory, because the Russians insist on controlling the whole of the Donbas region. Ukraine still occupies a good 20% of the Donetsk region itself. And that territory is extremely important for Ukraine's defenses. There are over 200,000 people living there. And the idea that the Ukrainians are just going to give this up and effectively surrender to Russia is not acceptable to Ukrainian public opinion. And it's something that President Zelensky, simply cannot contemplate doing. The only way he could, in theory, do that, and I say in theory, would be if Ukraine received robust security guarantees from the US and its European allies, and a situation could be envisaged where Ukraine could, in fact, develop peacefully as a viable independent state. And that's the one thing the Russians want to stop. So it's not just about territory for them. It's a question of limiting the size of Ukraine's armed forces, limiting the ability of its allies to reinforce it. And they know full well that the US is lukewarm about providing anything that one could call in a serious form a security guarantee.
Yeah. There was a suggestion from Zelensky during the Davos Forum, World Economic Forum, that security guarantees with the US had been agreed.
He referred to the fact that he had a conversation with President Trump and that some understanding seems to have been reached. But it all depends on what you classify as a security guarantee.
Right.
And the fact the US is definitely not going to put boots on the ground. Does it want to be dragged in, if the worst were to happen and the war would, start again? Would it want to be dragged into a conflict with Russia? Absolutely not. And you would have to demonstrate, I think, the intent to defend its, European allies at the same time. The US is talking about effectively reducing its commitment to its allies. And there are very serious questions now being asked, of course, now about the cohesion of NATO. So there are some really fundamental things happening in the transatlantic relationship. So the idea that the US is going to defend Ukraine in order to help its traditional European allies is, I think, a really sort of highly questionable thesis at the moment.
Yeah, gosh. So then, these talks, John, we shouldn't skip over the fact that it's the first time the three countries have been represented in the same room. How significant is that?
Well, first of all, I'm not sure that is entirely correct.
Okay.
Because in May last year, there were talks between the Russians and Ukrainians. I can't remember exactly if the Americans were close by. They may not have been in the room at the same time, but there was certainly direct contact between Russians and Ukrainians. So this time we don't know exactly how it's going to work, whether the Americans are going to be, the mediators in the room, or whether they're outside the room, whether the delegations are talking separately to the Americans, and then the Americans are, delivering the position that was agreed, supposedly, or discussed to the other side. But these talks are shrouded in secrecy at the moment. There's an agreement, I think, has been reached that it all needs to be kept, very, very tight hold. So it's difficult to know.
Yeah.
But I suppose it's significant that they are continuing the discussions today, that talks haven't broken off. And I would expect they're not going to be able to accomplish very much. The sides will commit to a continuation of the process. They go back to the capitals to consult further, and then have another go to see if they can actually narrow the differences. But I don't really see at this stage how the differences can be narrowed, because Putin wants to win this war. He believes the peace process is the way to help him do that. He thinks that Trump is effectively on his side. The Ukrainians don't see any need to stop fighting right now, despite the terrible punishment they're taking from the air. The fact that something like 80% of the apartment blocks in Kiev are without heating and electricity is an indication, I think, of the humanitarian problem that's growing in Ukraine as the Russians simply decimate Ukraine's critical infrastructure. So for now, I suspect the war is going to continue, and a so-called peace process will continue in parallel, until perhaps the point is reached where President Trump loses interest, because he frankly has other things to do at the moment, whether it's Greenland, Venezuela, Cuba, Gaza. I think the bandwidth for dealing with Ukraine is diminishing by the day.
John, thank you very much indeed. Great to speak to you. Thanks for your time.
Thank you.
That's John Lough, who was the first NATO representative in Moscow. He's now at the new Eurasian Strategies think tank. Donald Trump certainly has a lot on his plate, doesn't he? How high a priority is peace in Ukraine? He, of course, formed his board of peace in the last few days. I'm not sure how much peace that's going to bring in the years ahead. Anyway, good to hear from John this morning.